Now we're going to begin to talk about the later period of the history of ancient Egypt. So we start to find the Old Kingdom collapsing because the flooding of the Nile became less regular, and because the flooding of the Nile became less decreased in volume. And so this meant that there was less food. It meant that people began to lose their respect for the pharaohs. And so the Old Kingdom fell and was replaced by the Middle Kingdom around 2050, which succeeded in reunifying Europe. But by this point, the authority of the pharaohs was weaker. They had to compete with priests, a new priest class. And so now, again, we have that split between where previously the ruler and the priest was the same person. Now they're becoming different people. And the Middle Kingdom is going to fall for the same reason that the Older Kingdom falls. There's a loss of consistency in the flooding of the Nile, destructive floods, floods that don't provide enough silt and enough food. And so once again, we see the pharaohs and the officials of the Middle Kingdom losing their authority. And around 1700, a group called the Hyksos, who were not Egyptians, but were a tribe from Palestine and from the Middle East, were able to enter into Europe enter into Egypt and conquer the Nile Delta area of Egypt, so the heart of Egypt. Now, there weren't enough Hyksos to rule all of Egypt, but so they allowed Egyptian nobles to continue to rule the outlying regions of the kingdom and acknowledge their sovereignty. The Hyksos introduced important innovations into Egyptian society: the use of chariots and bows, archery, as well as the use of crop rotation. Crop rotation, really important because Egypt had been totally reliant on the Nile River and the crops that were grown during the growing season associated with the flooding of the Nile. And so if the flood doesn't work out for whatever reason that year, people die of hunger. And so the Hyksos, who came from a drier climate, showed the Egyptians how to develop crops that could be grown that weren't so dependent on the flooding of the Nile. The Hyksos ruled Egypt for about 200 years. Again, the scale of the ancient world here is something that is important for us to consider. 200 years ago is 1820, pre-American Civil War, pre-50 states. So it seems like a small amount of time in the way that we're talking about time. But thought about it in the broader context of the modern world, it's a huge amount of time. So the Hyksos rule Egypt for 200 years, but after 200 years, they're driven out. This is important because it shows that even for this immense period of time, even for 200 years, the Egyptians still retained some kind of cultural identity that they recognized set them apart from the Hyksos. And so this is the achievement of the New Kingdom, led by Amos I. What's interesting is that in this depiction of Amos that you see here, he depicts himself riding in a chariot. And so it shows you the ways that the Egyptians had retained their own cultural identity. They recognized there was something about them that made them different from the Hyksos. They wanted to restore the rule, their own rule of their own territory. But at the same time, they are also adopting aspects of Hyksos culture. The New Kingdom, founded by Amos when he drove out the Hyksos, is most famous for being the dynasty or the dynasties of great military commanders. And so Thutmose is famous for campaigning further south of Egypt and north into the Middle East and establishing an Egyptian empire that stretched beyond the traditional boundaries of Europe. His daughter Hatshepsut is famous for establishing a great trading network that was associated with this empire and bringing trade to Egypt from Arabia. Now, Egypt was traditionally polytheistic, and traditionally their gods were associated with fertility, just like the religious practices of ancient Mesopotamia. But around 1350, a pharaoh named Amenhotep IV, changed his name to reflect his belief in a single god, that there was a single god named Ammon. And so here we have one of the first examples of monotheism in the ancient world. And this reflects a more philosophical approach to religion as opposed to the agricultural approach that associated different agricultural phenomena with different gods. Now we start to see a more philosophical approach, this idea of kind of a god who's a first mover, who sets things in motion, and then there are natural explanations for the other phenomena that have been associated with gods before. Why does Amenhotep do this? A couple of reasons are possible. One is that the cult of the god Ammon, the sun god in Egypt, had become extremely powerful, and the priests of Ammon owned an immense amount of land in Egypt and were basically creating their own separate government. So it's maybe that Amenhotep wanted to weaken their power. The other is the idea that he really believes it. Again, in the modern world, we tend to be resistant to the idea of genuine religious belief driving historical change, but this is a real plausible possibility. However, it does seem that in this case, it's a little unlikely because Amenhotep uh, basically concentrates more power in his own hands and in the hands of the pharaoh and the government. So it does seem as though it's more of a power grab than something that's genuinely religious. This leads to division, civil war in Egypt, the weakening of the Egyptian empire, the New Kingdom. Amenhotep's son, Tutankhamun, chooses the name Tutankhamun with the name Amun at the end of it as a sign that he's restoring the traditional cult of the god Amun. But even with Tutankhamun and his followers, you have a succession of weak pharaohs who die young or who struggle to control their kingdom. After this confusion and civil war, you have new pharaoh, Ramses I. Ramses I, very successful, rebuilding the Egyptian empire, winning battles as far away as Syria, and restoring the Egyptian empire in one of the longest reigns in history. That brings us to the end of our discussion of ancient Egypt. We're going to talk about the Iron Age in the next video.